Sometime around about 1980, I came to the conclusion that the big problem for the age of Aquarius would be the individual versus society. I thought I wrote it in Thundersqueak, but I looked the other day and I couldn't find the references. I know I said it somewhere. Now, more interesting was the sort of reasoning behind that. I had been reading an astrologer writing about the age of Pisces. It was almost certainly Liz Green, because I like her stuff. And what the astrologer pointed out was that the age of Pisces, Pisces is the planet of self-sacrifice, the ending of things, martyrdom. And that fitted very well with Crowley's idea of the age of Osiris, where we're ruled by gods that, on the whole, male gods like Dionysus, Woden, Christ, who sacrificed themselves or made big sacrifices in order to help mankind. And that fits very nicely with Crowley's idea of the Aeon of Osiris. And what this person suggested was that we should look, when we're working with a particular sun sign, we should look at the sign opposite, because sometimes it plays a sort of Jungian shadow role to that sign. And in the case of Pisces, the opposite sign is Virgo. Now, I know that we nowadays think of the Virgin as a man or a woman who hasn't had sex. But back in the days when astrology was being founded, it had a very different meaning. It was about an independent woman. And of course, that would include a young girl who hasn't had sex and so was not related to a man. But it also included any woman who was not attached in a heterosexual relationship. So, for example, Crowley, in one of his ritual instructions, says you need the services of a virgin. And what he meant in that case was a prostitute, because unless she's under a pimp, a prostitute is a woman who is independent, acting on her own, independent of any particular male. And the word, in its older sense, associates with the word virago. And that's a clue, because a virago is a sort of a negative word. And what was suggested was that the idea of the independent, unattached woman has always played a sort of shadow role in the age of Osiris. Something fearful about it. And this erupts from time to time in things like the persecution of witches, or people's fears of a woman playing a leading role, acting independently. And I thought that was very interesting, and it made me think, well, what about the age of Aquarius, which we were supposed to be going into at that time? Now, Aquarius is very much the sign of society, the group, the collective, and the sort of rationality and humanism that goes with that. But interestingly, the sign opposite is Leo, which is very much the sign of an individual acting in his or her own kingdom. It's like the king who has dominion over his own realm. And so that was why I was suggesting that we will be coming to an age when there'll be tensions between the individual and society, and that the society will tend to see the individual from time to time playing a shadow role, becoming something threatening, fear of the individual. And there are many ways that I see that happening. I mean, I've written about magical thinking, and to me, magic is very much an individual activity. Even when it's done in a group, it's really more about the individual's experience, whereas society is about the herd acting together. And more extreme, there's a fear in our society at present of the individual who does not fit in. You know, these stories of Unabomber and people like that. The idea, people are frightened of the idea of the very clever individual. And whenever there's a sort of shootout or something, the media are very quick to pick up people saying, oh, he was a bit of a loner, you know, he was different, that sort of thing. And I think there is this sort of shadow fear that groups of people have against the individual who stands apart. Now, because of that, I've often been on the lookout for signs of this sort of fracture. And some of them sometimes are really quite subtle, I think. And there was an interesting example of that in the early 90s, at the start of the Gulf War, where there was quite a sort of strong gung-ho feeling of, you know, we're going to war, thump, 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 you know. I usually try to avoid British tabloid newspapers. I find them pretty offensive, but occasionally you come across them in a hairdresser or something. And I found myself reading one which the front page news was about a young British soldier that had died in the Gulf War. And I found it really offensive because they were pumping it up into a story of national heroism. Now, I'm not against national heroism, but to me it's all about when Britain or some country finds itself up against a superior enemy, a larger or, you know, better armed enemy, and manages to prevail, like in Dunkirk or the Battle of Britain, where a few held off a mighty attacking force. Now that's, to me, is a story of British heroism, and I can feel quite proud about it. But to try to pump up the story of Britain and America, two of the sort of best armed countries in the world, of sophisticated, well-trained soldiers, going and fighting Iraq, a country where I think the majority of Americans couldn't even place it on the map. To pump that up as a sort of story of example of British heroism, to me was almost an act of treason. It was so offensive. Now, does that mean that I didn't think that the soldier was a hero? Not at all. Because when I shift from the sort of public story, British story, to the individual, it doesn't matter how well armed you are or what's behind you. Going into a battle zone is scary. And I am sure that guy was a real hero. And if I was in his family, I would happily stand up. I say happily, that's not really the word. I would stand up and be prepared to make a speech about his heroism and how brave he is. Because I think in this individual level, that is true. But I just hated the fact that this newspaper was exploiting an individual and a family's suffering to try to make a headline story out of it. And so I wrote and complained to the paper. Now, that sounds a lot of fuss about, you know, just a newspaper story. But what really offended me was there was another article tucked away inside the paper, another story, which was about some minor celebrity, I think he'd been a pop star or something, who had died of AIDS. And the family, I think, had tried to hush it up because of the disgrace of dying of AIDS. Now, what I said in this letter is, surely that should have been the front page news, because not like big countries attacking Iraq, bullying, if you like, the person who struggled against AIDS is up against a very superior enemy. this was the early 90s, and AIDS had defeated every country in the world. It had even defeated America. A fortune had been spent, and they hadn't managed to combat the virus at that stage, the HIV virus. So that was real heroism, fighting a disease like that, a mighty force like that. And the other point was that dying for one's country, you see, it must cost about £500,000 to train a modern soldier, the technology and everything. And if that soldier dies, it's not a triumph for the country, it's a disaster. You don't spend all that money and train them in order to go and get killed. It's a loss, not a triumph. Whereas the person who died of AIDS, in dying, had taken his vulnerability to the disease out of the human gene pool. So in fact, he was dying for mankind. So I said, it's ridiculous. You've made a really offensive story, a treasonous story, denigrating British heroism on the front page, and someone who really was a hero, tackling a really mighty enemy, you've tucked away in the back pages, make it sound like a disgrace. Now, the reason I was thinking of this story, way back, it was more than 20 years ago, was because recently with the coronavirus, I've heard the expression gaining herd immunity. And I thought, yeah, that's what I was talking about. I didn't have that phrase, but I was talking about the way that when people die of a serious disease, it contributes to the immunity of the herd, of humanity. And the example I had in mind back then, I didn't have that phrase, but the example I had in mind was, when the Europeans went exploring in the Americas, and I think the same happened in the South Seas, they had extraordinary victories against the natives of these other countries. And of course, they thought that meant God was on their side. But part of the reason for those victories is they brought diseases like smallpox, which the people in those countries, the natives, had no immunity to. So, like in North America, in South America, the natives there suffered really badly. Thousands, millions of them were dying of smallpox. And the reason the invaders didn't die of smallpox is that smallpox had been around Europe for a long time, and enough people have died of it to have built up an herd immunity so that it wasn't such a serious disease for the people who took it to those other countries. And so that was what is now called herd immunity, and I think it's a very interesting concept. But again, these stories sort of illustrate subtle versions of this tension between, the individual and the herd, and how people can look on someone dying of a disease as a sort of a shameful thing, whereas actually at another level they're dying for humanity. The other reason I'm thinking of this is, of course, I'm in my 70s, and I'm one of the vulnerable people for this coronavirus. And so I'm one of those who's more likely to be killed by it, even though I try to keep fit. But I think that I'd like to think that if I should find myself dying it, I'll try to remember this idea and feel at least a sense of pride that I'm dying for mankind. That would help me to face up to it, possibly. Who knows? That's a sad note to end on, but I should just say perhaps what happened to that letter I wrote to the paper. Of course, nothing happened. It's not the sort of thing that British tabloid newspapers want to publish or even admit. I heard no more.